The first blow didn't just rattle the door, it rattled the very foundation of the house I'd spent 40 years building. It was midnight, the kind of heavy, humid Midwestern midnight where the air feels like a wet wool blanket. I was jolted upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. At 72, you expect the middle of the night to bring silence or the occasional ache in your joints, not the sound of a sledgehammer seeking entry into your sanctuary. I didn't reach for the light. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the wood groan and the metallic ring of the tool hitting the reinforced deadbolt I'd installed just 3 days prior. I'd seen this coming. I'd felt the shift in the wind months ago, but seeing it, hearing it, was different. It was the sound of my own blood, coming to claim what they hadn't earned. "William, open this door right now. We know you're in there." That was Danielle, my daughter-in-law. Her voice usually had this polished, country club lilt to it, the kind of voice that spent its days ordering expensive lattes and talking down to retail clerks. Now, it was a jagged shriek, stripped of all its fake elegance. It was the sound of desperation. "Dad, don't make me do this," Robert's voice followed, deeper but cracking. My son, my only son, the man I had taught to fish, to drive, and to carry himself with pride. Now he was standing on my porch with a sledgehammer, treating his father's home like a barricaded vault. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I wanted them to feel the silence. I wanted them to realize that the man who had built Miller Logistics from a single rusted-out flatbed into a multi-state empire wasn't going to be scared by a little noise. But as I sat there, I realized I hadn't just built a company. I'd built a family on a foundation of sand, and the tide was finally coming in. I didn't know it yet, but the events of the next hour would be the culmination of a year-long betrayal that went far deeper than just money. I moved to the window, staying in the shadows. Below, in the driveway, sat Robert's luxury SUV, a vehicle I'd paid for. Beside it was my daughter Chloe's sedan. They were all here. The whole rescue party. They weren't here to save me, though. They were here to serve the paperwork that would effectively erase my existence. My name is William Miller. People in the Rust Belt call me Iron Will, and for most of my life, I took it as a compliment. I arrived in Chicago at 17 with $50 in my pocket and a hole in my boot. I washed dishes until my hands bled. I hauled crates until my back felt like it was fused together. I didn't have a degree, and I didn't have a safety net. What I had was a stubborn refusal to stay poor. By 30, I had 3 trucks. By 40, I had 30. By 50, I was the man people called when they needed something moved across the country yesterday. I married Teresa when I was 25, and for 36 years, she was my North Star. She was the one who smoothed my rough edges. She was the one who made sure the kids had everything I never did. And maybe that was the mistake. When Teresa died of cancer 6 years ago, the light in our family didn't just dim, it went out. I was too busy drowning in my own grief to notice that without her, Robert and Chloe were starting to drift. They didn't have the hunger I had. They had the appetite, sure, but not the hunger. They wanted the lifestyle, the prestige, and the influence, but they lacked the calluses on their hands that made those things meaningful. Robert was 40 now, a man who looked like $1 million and didn't have a cent of his own to show for it. I'd made him director of operations, a title that came with a 6-figure salary and almost zero accountability. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was giving him a legacy. What I was actually doing was feeding a monster. The trouble really started about 8 months ago. It began with small things, a missed meeting here, a late arrival there. Then, I started noticing discrepancies in the operational budgets. A few $1,000s shifted to consulting fees that had no paper trail. I confronted Robert in my office. I remember the way he leaned back in his chair, checking his gold watch, acting like I was an inconvenience. "It's just accounting stuff, Dad," he'd said with a dismissive wave. "The world doesn't work on ledger books and handshakes anymore. You're too focused on the past. You need to let the new generation handle the logistics." "The new generation hasn't seen a balance sheet that wasn't in the red in 3 months, Robert," I'd snapped back. He'd left the office in a huff, but it was the look he gave me at the door, a look of pure, unadulterated resentment that stayed with me. It was the look of a man who was tired of waiting for his inheritance. A few weeks later, I was at the office late on a Friday. I'd forgotten my reading glasses in the boardroom. As I approached the door, I heard voices, Robert's, and another I recognized immediately, James, Chloe's husband. James was a lawyer, The kind of guy who wore suits that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. He had the smile of a man who was always looking for the fine print to screw you over. "The doctor says it's easy to document," James was saying, his voice smooth and clinical. "Mild cognitive impairment, confusion, erratic decision-making. We just need 2 signatures and a judge who's sympathetic to protecting the elderly from themselves." "And what about the company?" Robert asked. He sounded nervous, but eager. "Once the guardianship is established, you and Chloe are the co-conservators. You'll have full power of attorney. We can sell the logistics arm to that group out of Dubai before the end of the quarter. You'll be sitting on $40 million before the ink is dry on the court order." $40 million, Robert whispered. I could almost hear the greed dripping off his tongue. "And Dad?" "He'll be cared for," James replied. "There's a facility in the suburbs, high-end. He'll have a nice room, 3 meals a day, and someone to make sure he doesn't wander off. It's for his own good, Robert. He's becoming a liability." I stood in the hallway, the air freezing in my lungs. My son and my son-in-law were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could strip mine the company I'd built and toss me into a gilded cage. They weren't just planning to steal my money, they were planning to steal my life. I didn't storm in there. I didn't yell. My father always told me that if you're going to hit someone, you don't warn them first. You wait until they think they've already won. I walked out of that building, went home, and sat in my study for 6 hours. I didn't turn on the lights. I just watched the shadows move across the floor. Over the next few months, I played the part. I let myself forget where I put my keys. I asked the same question twice in meetings. I watched them exchange those little, "look at poor Dad," glances across the dinner table. Chloe would pat my hand and talk to me like I was a toddler, asking if I'd taken my vitamins, while James watched me with those shark eyes, waiting for a slip-up. But while I was playing the fool, I was also working. I hired a private investigator named Miller, no relation, who was a former forensic accountant. I wanted to know where Robert's consulting fees were really going. What he found was worse than I'd imagined. Robert wasn't just greedy, he was drowning. He'd gotten involved in a high-stakes offshore gambling ring and owed a group of very unpleasant people nearly $2 million. He wasn't just trying to sell my company for the lifestyle. He was trying to sell it to save his own skin. And James? James was getting a kickback from the Dubai group for facilitating the distressed sale. They were vultures, circling a man they thought was already dead. 3 days ago, I'd made my move. I'd restructured the corporate bylaws, moved the majority of my personal assets into an irrevocable trust, and changed my will. I also changed the locks on my house and the security codes at the office. That brings us back to tonight. The sledgehammer, the screaming. The door finally gave way. The frame splintered with a sickening crack, and the heavy oak door swung open, hitting the interior wall with a thud that echoed through the house. I stood at the top of the stairs, still in the shadows. Robert stepped into the foyer first, the sledgehammer hanging from his hand. He looked disheveled, his expensive shirt soaked with sweat. Behind him were Danielle, Chloe, and James. James was holding a stack of legal documents. "Dad," Robert called out, his voice echoing in the hallway. "We know you're here. We're doing this because we love you. You're not well. You've locked yourself in like a crazy person." I took a step forward, into the light of the chandelier. I was wearing my best suit. I had a glass of scotch in one hand, and my phone in the other. "You're late, Robert," I said calmly. My voice didn't tremble. It was the voice of the man who had built an empire. "And you've ruined a perfectly good door." They all froze. They looked at me, then at each other. James was the first to recover. He stepped forward, trying to put on his professional face. "William, please. This is an intervention. We have a court-ordered temporary guardianship. We're here to take you to a place where you can get the help you need. Robert, help your father down the stairs." Robert started toward me, but I raised my hand. "Before you take another step, Robert, you might want to look at your phone. I just sent you an email. You too, James." "Dad, what are you talking about?" Robert spat, but his hand instinctively went to his pocket. The silence that followed was heavy. I watched their faces as they opened the files I'd sent. I watched Robert turn from red with anger to a ghostly, sickly white. I watched James's jaw tighten as he realized the confidential contracts he'd signed with the Dubai group were no longer confidential. "That's a full forensic audit of the last 3 years, Robert," I said, leaning against the railing. "It details every cent you stole. And James, those are the recordings of your meetings with the buyers. You see, I might be old, but I've always been very good at logistics, and I've spent the last 3 months shipping all your secrets into a very secure location. You old bastard," Danielle hissed, her face contorting. "You played us?" I protected myself. I corrected her. "Now, here's how this is going to go. Robert, you have 10 seconds to drop that hammer. James, you have 10 seconds to drop those papers." "Or what?" James sneered, though his eyes were darting toward the door. "You're one old man. We have the court order." Actually, a new voice came from the dining room. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out from the shadows of the kitchen. It was August, my oldest friend and a retired police captain. Behind him were 2 men in dark suits, private security I'd hired through Miller's firm. "Actually," August said, "you have a problem. Because while you were busy breaking down that door, my associates were recording the whole thing. Trespassing, destruction of property, and attempted kidnapping of a senior citizen. That court order you're holding? It was issued based on fraudulent medical testimony. My lawyer is already speaking with the judge who signed it." Robert dropped the sledgehammer. The heavy metal head hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. "Dad," Chloe sobbed, stepping forward. "Please, we were just worried." "Don't," I said, and the word cut through her like a blade. "Don't ever use that word with me again. You weren't worried about me. You were worried about the bank account." I looked down at them from the top of the stairs. They looked small. For 30 years I'd looked at them and seen my future. Now, all I saw was the debris of a life I'd failed to raise correctly. "Get out," I said. "William, let's talk about this," James started, his lawyer brain already trying to find an angle. "There is no talk," I replied. "By tomorrow morning, Robert, your position at the company will be officially terminated. James, the Bar Association will be receiving a very thick folder regarding your ethics, and, as for this house, it's no longer your family home. It's a crime scene. And you're the intruders." "You can't do this," Danielle screamed. "We have children, your grandchildren." "The grandchildren will be taken care of," I said. "But you're on your own. Now leave, before I decide that I don't want to wait for the morning to call the police." They retreated. It wasn't a dignified exit. They scrambled out the splintered remains of the door, Robert stumbling, James clutching his phone like a lifeline. I stood there until I heard their cars roar out of the driveway. August walked to the bottom of the stairs, looking up at me. "You okay, Will?" "No," I said, my voice finally cracking just a little. "But I'm still here." I walked back into my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the photo of Teresa on the nightstand. She looked so happy, so full of life. I wondered if she'd be proud of me for fighting back, or heartbroken that it had come to this. I thought the worst was over. I thought I'd won. I'd exposed the plot, protected the company, and kicked the vipers out of my nest. But as I sat there in the quiet house, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think a few documents can stop what's coming. Robert isn't the only one who owes us, William, and we don't care about your audits. We want our money. See you soon." My blood ran cold. Robert hadn't just put himself in danger. He had brought the wolves to my doorstep, and they didn't care about legal trusts or corporate bylaws. What happened next changed everything. The morning sun crept across the floor of my study, illuminating the fine layer of dust that had settled over everything, a quiet reminder that life goes on, even when your world has just been detonated. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the hours between the text message and dawn sitting in my armchair, staring at the splintered remains of my front door. August had insisted on staying. He was downstairs now, talking quietly on his cell phone, likely calling in favors from his days on the force. He was the only person I trusted to watch my back, but even his presence couldn't ease the cold knot in my stomach. The wolves were no longer a metaphor. Robert's gambling debts had turned my family drama into a life-or-death situation. I walked down the stairs, my joints clicking with every step. The physical damage to the house was jarring in the daylight. The heavy oak door, which I had picked out with Teresa 30 years ago, hung crookedly on its hinges. It looked like a gaping wound. "The text came from a burner," August said, looking up as I entered the kitchen. He poured me a cup of coffee, black and strong. "My guy traced the signal to a tower near the docks. It's a dead end, Will. These people know how to stay invisible." "They want $2 million, I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "That's what Robert owes. He didn't just steal from the company to buy fancy cars, August. He was trying to pay off the interest on a debt that never ends." You can't pay them, August warned, his eyes narrowing. You pay a wolf once, he just brings the rest of the pack back for dessert. We need to find Robert. He's not answering, I said. None of them are. They're probably huddled in James's office right now, trying to figure out how to spin the fact that I've got them dead to rights on embezzlement. I took a sip of the coffee, letting the heat wake up my senses. My mind drifted back to 5 years ago, to the first time I realized Robert was slipping. We were at a charity gala, and Robert had been bragging to a group of investors about a huge new contract he'd landed. I knew for a fact the contract didn't exist. When I pulled him aside later, he'd laughed it off, saying he was just priming the pump. I didn't push him. I wanted to believe he was just ambitious, a little too eager to prove himself. I didn't see it for what it was, the beginning of a life built on lies. I had spent so many years protecting him from the harsh realities of the world that I'd forgotten to teach him how to survive them with his integrity intact. I had traded his character for his comfort, and now I was paying the price. Around Muri. Home AM, my personal assistant, Linda called. Her voice was frantic. Mr. Miller, you need to turn on the news. Channel Bone. They're doing a segment on the company. I felt a fresh wave of nausea. I walked to the living room and clicked on the television. There, standing in front of the Miller Logistics headquarters, was Chloe. She was wearing a simple dark dress, her hair slightly messy, the distressed daughter look. Beside her was James, looking solemn and professional. My father is a great man, Chloe was telling the reporter, her voice trembling with practiced precision. But we've been concerned about his mental health for a long time. He's become increasingly paranoid, even aggressive. Last night, he had a breakdown and chased us out of his house. We're heartbroken. We just want him to get the help he needs before he hurts himself or the company. James stepped forward, adjusting his tie. As the family's legal counsel, we've filed an emergency petition for an involuntary psychiatric hold. We believe Mr. Hewitt Miller is a danger to himself and his estate. We are asking the public and the employees of Miller Logistics to remain calm while we navigate this tragic family matter. I turned off the TV. The room felt like it was spinning. They're moving fast, August said, standing in the doorway. That emergency petition is a direct response to your audit. They're trying to lock you up before you can file the criminal charges against Robert. If you're in a psych ward, you can't testify. You can't sign documents. You become a non-person. They think I'm an old man who's going to roll over and play dead, I whispered. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage that I hadn't felt in decades. They really think I built this company by being weak. What's the move, Will? I'm going to the office, I said. If they want to take the company, they're going to have to do it in front of every man and woman who works there. And, August, call the forensic accountant. I want that audit leaked to the board of directors by noon. Not the police, yet the board. I want the people who own the shares to see exactly who's been robbing them blind. I put on my coat and headed for the garage. I didn't take the luxury car. I took the old Mutngin Chincham Ford pickup I'd kept all these years. It was loud, it smelled like diesel and history, and it reminded me of who I was before the money made my life complicated. The drive to the office was a blur. My mind was a battlefield. I thought about the Sunday dinners we used to have when the kids were small. I thought about Teresa's laugh. How had we gone from that to involuntary psychiatric holds and sledgehammers? When I pulled into the lot of Miller Logistics, the atmosphere was electric. Employees were huddled in small groups, whispering. They'd seen the news. They'd seen Chloe's performance. As I stepped out of the truck, the silence was deafening. I saw Robert's SUV parked in his reserved spot. So, he was here. He was hiding in his office, probably shredding documents or trying to move more money. I walked through the glass doors of the lobby. The receptionist, a girl named Mia, who I'd hired 3 months ago, looked at me like I was a ghost. Mr. Miller, I wasn't sure if you were coming in, she stammered. It's my name on the building, Mia, I said, giving her a small, tight smile. I'm not going anywhere. I took the elevator to the executive floor. When the doors opened, I was met by James. He was standing there with 2 men I didn't recognize, big guys in cheap suits, process servers, or something worse. William, James said, his voice loud enough for the entire floor to hear. You shouldn't be here. The police are on their way to escort you to the clinic. Please, don't make this harder on yourself than it already is. The only people leaving this building in handcuffs today, James, aren't going to be me," I said, walking right past him. I headed straight for Robert's office. I didn't knock. I kicked the door open. Robert was sitting behind his desk, a bottle of bourbon open in front of him. He looked like he'd aged a decade in a single night. He was staring at a stack of papers, the audit I'd sent him. "You really did it," he whispered, not even looking up. "You really destroyed me." "You destroyed yourself, Robert," I said, sitting in the chair across from him. "The moment you took the first dollar that didn't belong to you, you were done. The moment you invited those wolves into our lives, you ended this family." "They're going to kill me, Dad," he said, finally looking at me. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a terrifying mix of sorrow and self-pity. "If I don't get them the money, I'm a dead man." I thought if I could just get control of the company, I could sell the warehouse in Gary to pay them off. And then everything would go back to normal. "Normal?" I leaned forward. "You were going to put your father in a psych ward so you could pay off a gambling debt to a bunch of thugs? That's your normal?" "I didn't have a choice," he screamed, slamming his fist on the desk. "You never gave me enough. You always kept the strings so tight. I'm 40 years old, and I still have to ask you for permission to breathe. I gave you the world, Robert. I gave you everything I never had, and it still wasn't enough because you have a hole in your soul that money can't fill." The door opened behind me. James walked in, followed by the two men in suits. "That's enough," James said. "Robert, stay quiet. William, these gentlemen are here to transport you. The petition has been signed by a magistrate." "Signed based on what, James?" I asked, standing up slowly. "Based on your lies? Or maybe based on the testimony of a doctor you've been paying under the table?" "It doesn't matter," James sneered. "By the time you get a lawyer to challenge it, the company will be sold and Robert's problems will be solved. It's business, William, something you used to understand." I looked at my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the bourbon. "One last chance, Robert," I said. "Tell the truth. Tell them you're the one who's been stealing. Tell them you're the one who needs help. If you do that, I'll help you. I'll pay the debt. I'll keep you out of jail. But you have to be a man for once in your life." Robert's hand moved toward the bottle. He took a long swig, then looked at James. James gave him a tiny, imperceptible nod. "My father is delusional," Robert said, his voice flat. "Take him away." The two men moved toward me. I felt a surge of adrenaline, that old survival instinct from the docks kicking in. But before they could reach me, the intercom on Robert's desk buzzed. It was Mia, the receptionist. Robert, there's a group of men in the lobby. They say they're here for a meeting with you. They don't look like clients. They said to tell you the interest just went up." The color drained from Robert's face so fast he looked like he was going to faint. The wolves weren't waiting for the sale. They were here now. James looked at Robert, then at me. His cocky smile vanished. "What did you do, Robert? You told them we'd have the money today?" I told them the sale was a sure thing," Robert stammered. I looked at the two transport guards. They were looking at each other, realizing they'd walked into something much bigger than a family spat. "James," I said, "I think your business just got a lot more complicated." I walked toward the window and looked down at the parking lot. A black van was idling at the curb. 4 men were getting out. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing heavy jackets and expressions that promised nothing but pain. I turned back to the room. "The police will be here in 5 minutes to pick me up for that." "Psych hold you arranged, James." I wonder who's going to get to you first, the cops or the people Robert owes $2 million to. But then, I saw something on the security monitor on Robert's desk that made my heart stop. There was a second vehicle pulling into the lot, a small, familiar sedan. It was Chloe's car, and she wasn't alone. She had my grandchildren in the back seat. She was pulling right up next to the black van. "Robert," I whispered, pointing at the screen. "Tell me you didn't involve your sister's kids in this." Robert looked at the screen and let out a strangled cry. The men from the van were already moving toward Chloe's car. What happened next changed the game entirely, and I realized that my revenge was no longer about the company. It was about survival. The screen was small, grainy, and flickering with the blue tint of a low-budget security system. But the image was unmistakable. Chloe was stepping out of her car, a look of confused irritation on her face as she fumbled with her purse. In the back seat, I could see the small, blurry silhouettes of Sam and little Maya. They were laughing, probably playing on their tablets, completely oblivious to the four men in heavy jackets, closing in on their vehicle like ink spreading through water. "James, you coward," I hissed, my eyes never leaving the monitor. "You sent them here. You told her to bring the kids so the police wouldn't suspect anything while you hauled me away to that clinic." James didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He was staring at the screen, his face a mask of calculated panic. "I told her to meet us for lunch. I didn't think. I didn't know these people would show up here, William. This wasn't the plan." "Plan?" I turned on him, my hand gripping the edge of Robert's mahogany desk so hard the wood groaned. "You don't get to have a plan anymore. You invited the devil to dinner, and now he's asking for the kids for dessert." Robert was a hollow shell. He had collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands, mumbling something about not meaning for this to happen. He was a 40-year-old boy, terrified of the world he'd built out of lies and bourbon. I realized in that moment that if anyone was going to save my grandchildren, it wasn't going to be the men who shared their DNA. It was going to be the man they were currently trying to have committed. "August!" I shouted toward the door. August was already moving. He'd seen the feed on his own handheld device. "I'm on it, Will. Security is locked down, but those guys are already in the perimeter. If I go out there guns blazing, it's a bloodbath with the kids in the middle." "Then don't go out there guns blazing," I said, my mind racing. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. It was the same feeling I used to get 40 years ago when a shipment was lost in a blizzard and I had to find a way through. I'm going out there. They want the money. They want the man who holds the purse strings. "William, you're 72, August said, grabbing my arm. "You can't go out there." "I'm 72, and I'm the only one they'll listen to," I snapped, shaking him off. "James, give me your phone, now." James hesitated, his eyes darting toward the two transport guards, who were now standing awkwardly by the door. "Why?" "Because you have the contact for the man Robert owes. Give me the phone, or I swear to God, I'll let those men take Chloe, and I'll tell the police you coordinated the whole thing." It was a bluff, mostly, but James was a man built on self-preservation. He fumbled the phone out of his pocket and handed it over. I scrolled through his recent calls. There it was, a contact labeled V.L. Vinny. It had to be. I hit dial and stepped toward the window, looking down at the parking lot. I saw the lead man, a thick-necked individual with a scarred brow, reach for his pocket. He answered on the third ring. "James, this better be a confirmation of the wire." The voice was low, raspy like sandpaper on stone. "It's not James," I said, my voice steady. "It's William Miller, the man you're actually looking for." The man in the parking lot froze. He looked up toward the executive floor, his eyes scanning the windows until they landed on me. I didn't flinch. I stood there, framed by the glass, the iron will he'd heard stories about. "The old man," Vinny chuckled into the phone. "I heard you were losing your mind, William. You don't look crazy from here. I'm sane enough to know that if a single hair on my daughter or my grandchildren's heads is touched, you'll never see a dime of that 2 million. In fact, I'll spend 10 million making sure you and every one of your associates ends up at the bottom of Lake Michigan. I have the resources, Vinny. Do you?" The silence on the line was long. Down below, the other 3 men had reached Chloe's car. One of them put a hand on the door handle. Chloe was backing away, her hands up, her mouth moving in what I knew were terrified screams. "You're in no position to negotiate, Miller," Vinny said. "Your son gambled away your legacy. I'm just here to collect the house." "You collect the house by talking to me," I said. "Tell your boys to back off the car. Now, I'm coming down. Alone. We'll talk like businessmen. If you try to take them, the police who are already on their way for a different matter will be here in 3 minutes. You want a kidnapping charge on top of everything else?" Vinny looked at his watch, then signaled his men. They stepped back from the car, though they didn't leave. Chloe scrambled back into the driver's seat, locking the doors. I could see Sam's face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with a terror no child should ever know. 5 minutes, Miller," Vinny said and hung up. I turned back to the room. The 2 transport guards were looking at the floor. James was sweating through his silk shirt. Robert was still a ghost in his chair. "August, stay here," I said. "When the police arrive, tell them there's an armed confrontation in the lot, but tell them to hold back until I give the signal. I need to buy us time." "Will, this is suicide," August whispered. "No," I said, looking at Robert. "This is parenting, something I should have done a long time ago." I walked out of the office, through the lobby, and out the front doors. The air outside was crisp, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt 40 years younger. My legs didn't ache. My vision was sharp. I walked across the asphalt, my leather shoes clicking with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Vinny met me halfway. He was shorter than he looked on camera, but wider, built like a fire hydrant. He smelled of cheap cigars and expensive cologne. "You got balls, old man," he said, tucking his phone into his waistband. "I'll give you that." "I have $2 million, I replied. "And I have a son who is a coward. Let's not pretend this is about anything else." "It's about the principle," Vinny said, stepping closer. "Robert promised a payout. He used your company's name as collateral. When I found out he was being kicked out, the collateral disappeared. That makes people like me nervous." "Robert is an idiot," I said, "but he's my idiot. I'll cover the debt, on one condition." "You're making conditions." "I want the name of the person who told you I was being declared incompetent today," I said. Vinny blinked. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "You think it was just a lucky guess?" "I think James told you," I said. "I think he wanted you here to create a crisis. If you showed up and threatened the family, and he was the one who saved everyone by using the company funds he'd just gained control of, he'd be the hero. He'd get the money to you, he'd get the company, and I'd be locked away in a ward where no one would believe a word," I said. Vinny laughed, a dry hacking sound. "You're sharp. Your son-in-law is a snake, Miller. He called me last night. Said the old man was going down today and the taps would be open by noon. He told us to show up and pressure the situation to make sure you didn't put up a fight." I felt the betrayal settle into my bones. It wasn't just Robert's weakness, it was James's calculation. He had put his own wife and children in the path of these men just to ensure a smooth transition of power. He had used my grandchildren as props in a play designed to destroy me. "But here's the thing," Vinny continued, his voice dropping. "I don't like being a pawn in some lawyer's game, and I definitely don't like waiting for my money." "You won't have to wait," I said, "but you're going to help me with a little bit of logistics first." I spent the next 2 minutes talking. I didn't beg. I didn't plead. I spoke the language of profit and loss. By the time I was done, Vinny was nodding, a look of genuine respect in his eyes. "You really are a piece of work, William," he said. "Your kids don't deserve you." "I know," I said. "Now, tell your men to move. My daughter is going to drive out of here, and you're going to let her." Vinny signaled. The men stepped away from Chloe's sedan. I walked over to the car and tapped on the glass. Chloe rolled it down just an inch, her face streaked with tears. Dad, what's happening? Who are these people?" "Go home, Chloe," I said, my voice soft but unbreakable. "Take the kids. Don't go to your house. Go to the lake cottage. August has people there. Stay there until I call you." "But James said—" "James isn't who you think he is, Chloe," I said. "Look at your children. They're safe because of me, not him. Now, go." She looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the daughter I used to know, the one who trusted me to fix the world when it broke. She nodded, shifted the car into gear, and peeled out of the lot. I watched her go until her taillights disappeared. Then, I turned back to Vinny. "Now," I said, "let's go see my son-in-law." We walked back into the building, the wolves and the iron will. We took the elevator up in silence. When the doors opened, the police were already there. August's guys. They had James and Robert against the wall in the lobby. James looked up, his eyes widening as he saw me walking in with Vinny. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. "The psych hold is canceled, James," I said, walking right up to him. "The judge just got a call from the doctor you bribed. It seems he decided to tell the truth once August's friends mentioned the word medical board." "William, I can explain," James stammered. "There's nothing to explain," I said. "Vinny here was just telling me about your phone call last night, about how you wanted them to show up and pressure me while the kids were here." Robert looked at James, horror dawning on his face. "You did what? You put the kids at risk for the sale?" "I was trying to save your skin, Robert," James hissed. "You're the one who owed the money." "Enough," I barked. The room went silent. "James, you're going to jail, not for the company and not for the money. You're going for conspiracy and endangerment. I've already filed the paperwork." I turned to Robert. He looked like he was about to vomit. "And you," I said, "you're going to the lake house. You're going to sit in a room and you're going to write down every single lie you've told for the last 5 years. Every dollar, every name, and then You're going to help me dismantle everything James has built. And if I don't, Robert whispered. Then I'll let Vinny handle the collection, I said. Vinny stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. Robert nodded frantically. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had the pieces on the board exactly where I wanted them. I had the leverage, I had the truth, and I had the vipers pinned. But as the police were leading James away, he turned his head and looked at me with a smile that made the hair on my neck stand up. You think I'm the only one who wanted you gone, William, he whispered as he passed me. You think Robert was the only one with secrets? Ask Chloe about the Teresa Fund. Ask her what she did with the money your wife left her in secret. You're not the only one who's been played, old man. You're just the only one who hasn't realized the game is still going. He laughed as the elevator doors closed. I stood there, the silence of the office pressing in on me. The Teresa Fund. My wife hadn't left any secret money. Everything was accounted for. Or so I thought. I didn't know it yet, but the betrayal was only beginning to reveal its true depth, and what Chloe had been hiding was about to make everything Robert had done look like child's play. The elevator doors didn't just close on James. They closed on the version of my family I had spent 6 years trying to preserve. I stood in the middle of my executive lobby, the silence humming in my ears like a high-tension wire. Around me, my employees, the people I'd promised to protect, were staring. They'd seen the handcuffs. They'd seen Vinny. They'd seen the iron will bend. Just for a second, when James whispered that name, the Teresa Fund. I thought I knew my wife better than I knew the gears of a semi-truck. We had shared 36 years of beds, breakfasts, and business decisions. We didn't have secrets. Or so I had told myself every night since her funeral. But as I watched Robert trembling in the corner, still guarded by August's men, I realized that the house I lived in was built on a foundation of mysteries I was only just beginning to uncover. Will, we need to move, August said, his hand firm on my shoulder. The police are going to want a statement, and we've still got Vinny standing here like he's waiting for a tip. I looked at Vinny. He was checking his fingernails, perfectly content to wait. He knew I was good for the money now. I had something far more valuable than cash. I had the leverage of a man who had nothing left to lose. Pay him, I said to August. Use the contingency account. Get him out of my building, get him out of my city, and make sure he knows that if I ever see his face again, the next business meeting will be in a courtroom. You got it, boss, Vinny said, giving me a mock salute. You know, Miller, you really should have been the one running the gambling ring. You've got a much better poker face than your son. He disappeared down the elevator, taking his wolves with him. I turned to Robert. My son was staring at the floor, his breath coming in shallow hitches. The lake house, Robert, I said. Go, now. If you're not there when I arrive, I'll call the prosecutor myself and tell them James had an accomplice. He didn't argue. He scurried away, a broken man who had been outplayed by everyone, including his own father. I didn't go to the lake house immediately. I went to the one place where the truth couldn't be hidden by tears or lawyers, the basement of Miller Logistics, the archives. I called Maurice, my head accountant. He'd been with me since the days we were calculating fuel costs on napkins. He arrived 20 minutes later, his face pale, clutching a laptop like a shield. Maurice, I said, my voice echoing in the cold, concrete room. I need you to look for something. James mentioned a Teresa Fund. My wife didn't have a fund. She had a joint checking account and a small life insurance policy that went into the estate. Find me the ghost. Maurice didn't ask questions. He knew that tone. He spent the next 3 hours digging through digital footprints that had been buried under layers of corporate shells. I sat on a crate of old invoices, the smell of dust and stagnant air filling my lungs. I felt like a detective in my own life, hunting for the woman I had loved. Mr. Miller. Maurice's voice was small, hesitant. I found it. I stood up, my knees popping. Show me. On the screen was a private offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. It was opened 8 years ago, 2 years before Teresa died. The initial deposit was $500,000. Where did the money come from? I asked. It was siphoned from the logistics insurance rebates, Maurice explained, his fingers flying across the keys. Small amounts over 24 months. Amounts so small they looked like rounding errors. But here's the thing, sir. The account wasn't just in your wife's name. It was a joint account. With me? No, Maurice said, looking up at me with eyes full of pity. With Chloe. The air left the room. Chloe, my good child, the one who stayed home to help me after the funeral, the one who held my hand while I cried. She hadn't just been hiding a fund, she'd been building a lifeboat with her mother while I was still on the ship. And the balance? Empty, Maurice said. The last withdrawal was made 6 months ago, $200,000. The signature on the digital transfer. It was authenticated with a biometric key. Your wife's key. Teresa died 6 years ago, Maurice, I said, my voice a whisper. How can a dead woman sign a transfer? Someone kept her phone, sir, or her laptop. Someone who knew the passcodes. Someone who had her thumbprint. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I remembered Chloe insisted on taking care of her mother's personal effects after the funeral. She'd said it was too painful for me to handle. She'd spent weeks in Teresa's dressing room, boxing up clothes, jewelry, and electronics. I had thanked her for it. I had called her an angel. What I didn't know yet was that the angel had been spending the last 6 years looting a ghost. There's more, Maurice said. The $200,000 wasn't spent on clothes or houses. It was transferred to a legal defense firm, a firm specializing in elder law and guardianship litigation. The firm James works for. Chloe hadn't just known about the plan to declare me incompetent. She had financed it. She had used her mother's stolen money to pay the lawyers who were going to lock me away. I didn't yell. I didn't smash anything. I simply walked out of the basement, got into my truck, and drove toward the lake. The sunset was a bruised purple over the water, beautiful and cold. I thought about the many summers we'd spent at this cottage, the laughter, the boat rides, the feeling that as long as we were together, we were invincible. It was all a lie. It was a play, and I was the only one who hadn't read the script. I pulled into the gravel driveway of the cottage. Robert's car was there, Chloe's car was there, August's security team was stationed at the perimeter, silent shadows in the trees. I walked into the house. The living room was lit by the fireplace. Chloe was sitting on the sofa, a blanket over her shoulders, looking small and fragile. Robert was in the corner, staring at the fire. They looked like a family in mourning. Dad, Chloe said, standing up. She moved toward me, her arms open for a hug. Thank God you're here. Is it over? Is James? Is he really gone? I stepped back, avoiding her touch. The look of hurt that crossed her face was so perfect, so practiced, that for a second, I almost believed it. The Teresa Fund, Chloe, I said. She froze. The fragile look didn't disappear, but it hardened, like water turning to ice. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered. I think you do, I said, walking to the center of the room. I think you've known about it since before your mother died. I think the two of you decided that I was too iron-willed for my own good, that I was too stingy with the empire I built. So you started taking what you thought was yours. It was hers. Chloe suddenly snapped, her voice losing its sweetness. She stepped forward, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Mom worked just as hard as you did. She did the books. She managed the drivers. She kept this family together while you were out expanding. And what did she have to show for it? A monthly allowance? She wanted us to have something of our own, something you couldn't control. So she stole from the company? She secured her future, Chloe shouted. And after she died, I saw what was happening. I saw Robert drowning. I saw you getting older, getting more stubborn, more obsessed with the business, James said. James said the only way to save the family was to take the wheel. He said if we didn't, you'd drive us all off a cliff. And using her thumbprint? I asked, my voice dangerously low. Using a dead woman's identity to steal $200,000 to pay for my internment. Was that Mom's wish too? Chloe flinched. She looked at Robert, but Robert was looking at his shoes. We were desperate, she whispered. James said it was the only way to protect the assets from the gambling debts. He said if you found out about Robert, you'd disinherit us both. We were trying to save each other, Dad. By destroying me, I said, by making the world believe I was a senile old man. You were going to lock me in a room and visit me once a year, weren't you? Pat my hand and tell me how nice the gardens were while you spent the money your mother and I earned with our sweat. It wasn't like that, she sobbed. It was exactly like that, I said. I looked at my two children, my legacy. One was a thief and a gambler. The other was a manipulator and an identity thief. They had turned my love into a weapon and used it to stab me in the back. What happened next changed everything, I said, mostly to myself. What? Robert asked, finally speaking up. The police are on their way here, I said. Chloe's eyes went wide. What? No, Dad, you said James was the one. You can't do this to us. I'm not doing anything to you, I said. I'm just doing what I should have done years ago. I'm letting you face the world without me to protect you. I've turned over the evidence of the offshore account to the federal authorities. Wire fraud, identity theft, embezzlement. It's out of my hands now. Dad, please. Chloe fell to her knees, reaching for my hand. Think of the grandkids. Think of Sam and Maya. If I go to jail, what happens to them? They'll stay with me, I said, and my heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. They'll grow up in a house where the truth matters, where they don't have to hide who they are. They'll be the only part of this family that survives. The blue and red lights began to flash against the trees outside. The sirens were faint, but getting closer. Chloe's face transformed. The tears stopped. She stood up, looking at me with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. You think you've won, don't you? She hissed. You think you're the hero of this story, but you're just a lonely old man in a big house. We didn't just want the money, Dad. We wanted to be away from you. We wanted to breathe without your iron will crushing our lungs, even Mom. Why do you think she kept that account? She was planning to leave you, William. She was just waiting for us to graduate. The world tilted. Teresa, planning to leave? You're lying, I whispered. Ask Maurice to look for the travel records. Chloe sneered as the police walked through the door. Look for the apartment she rented in Florida. She was gone, Dad. She just didn't have the heart to tell you before the cancer did. I stood there as the officers led them away. I watched my children be marched out of the cottage in the same handcuffs James had worn. The silence returned, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the silence of a house. It was the silence of a tomb. I walked to the window and watched the cars pull away. I was alone. I had my company. I had my money. I had my iron will. But I didn't know it yet. The biggest secret was still waiting for me back in the city, buried in a place I had never thought to look. And it was a secret that would make me question every single day of the 36 years I had spent with Teresa. The drive back to Chicago was a blur of gray asphalt and bitter reflections. I had won. My enemies were in handcuffs, my company was secure, and my house was mine again. So why did I feel like I was the one being buried? Chloe's words sat in the passenger seat next to me, more suffocating than the silence of the lake house. She was planning to leave you, William. It's a strange thing, being a man who has conquered every logistical nightmare imaginable, only to find out you were the one blind spot in your own marriage. I had tracked millions of tons of freight across the globe, but I hadn't tracked the heart of the woman sleeping 3 inches away from me. I pulled into my driveway at home AM. The splintered door was boarded up with plywood, a temporary patch on a permanent scar. I didn't go to bed. I went to the one place in the house I rarely entered, Teresa's sewing room. It was a small, sun-drenched space at the back of the house that still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume and cedar. I had kept it exactly as she left it, a shrine to a woman I thought I knew. I began to tear it apart, not with the fury of Robert's sledgehammer, but with a clinical, desperate precision. I searched the floorboards. I emptied the drawers of her antique desk. I felt like a scavenger picking through the bones of a ghost. And then, I found it. Tucked behind a false back in the bottom drawer of her sewing cabinet was a small, black leather-bound ledger and a key to a storage unit in a suburb I'd never visited. I sat on the floor, the ledger heavy in my lap. I opened it, and the handwriting hit me like a physical blow. It was hers, elegant, precise, the script of the woman who used to help me balance my books when we only had one truck. As I flipped through the pages, the Teresa Fund took on a terrifying clarity. It wasn't just a lifeboat, it was a chronicle of secrets. The payments, regular monthly transfers of home, dating back 10 years. The recipient, a name I didn't recognize, Elias Thorne. The location, a small town in the Rust Belt, my hometown. The memo, every single entry had the same word written in the margin, protection. My blood ran cold. Elias Thorne. The name tasted like copper in my mouth. I hadn't thought of that name in 50 years. Elias was the son of my first boss, the man whose restaurant I'd washed dishes in back in the small town I'd fled at 17. I leaned my head against the wall and closed my eyes. Chloe had said her mother was leaving me, but this ledger didn't look like an escape plan. It looked like a blackmail ledger. I had spent my life building a legend of the self-made man. I told everyone I arrived in Chicago with $50 and a dream. I never mentioned the fire. I never mentioned the reason I had to leave that small town in the middle of the night with ash on my clothes and fear in my throat. My phone buzzed on the floor beside me. It was August. "Will, we've got a problem. A big one." "Tell me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The Dubai Group Global Logistics International. They're not just a corporation, Will. We did a deeper dive into their board of directors. One of their silent partners is a holding company owned by a man named Thorne. Does that mean anything to you?" I felt the room tilt. "Alias Thorne?" "The very same," August said, his voice grim. "It looks like James didn't just find a buyer for your company. He found the one man who's been nursing a grudge against you for half a century. Thorne wasn't just buying your company, Will. He was buying you. He wanted to own the man who ran away. They used my children." "August," I said, a new kind of horror dawning on me. "They didn't just manipulate Robert and Chloe. They targeted them. They knew Robert was a gambler. They knew James was a shark. They fed them the plan, knowing they'd be too greedy to see the hook." "It gets worse," August continued. "The feds are looking into the offshore account Chloe was using. They're finding ties to Thorne's holding company. It looks like the Teresa Fund wasn't just money your wife stole. It was money Thorne was feeding her. She wasn't blackmailing him, Will. He was paying her to keep quiet about something. Or maybe she was paying him to protect you from the truth coming out." I hung up the phone. The room felt like it was closing in. I looked at the ledger again. If Teresa was paying Thorne, she was doing it to keep my past buried. She was protecting the image of the man I'd become. But in doing so, she'd given him the coordinates to my family's destruction. I didn't wait for morning. I drove to the storage unit in the suburbs. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. I used the key I'd found in the sewing room. The unit was small, filled with boxes labeled miscellaneous, but at the very back was a single metal filing cabinet. I pulled open the top drawer. Inside were folders meticulously organized records of every business deal I'd ever made. But at the very bottom was a single envelope addressed to me, to William, for when the silence becomes too loud. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from Teresa, dated 3 months before she died. "William, if you are reading this, then the world I tried to build for you has finally crumbled. I know you think I was just a quiet wife, the one who stayed home while you conquered the world. But I saw the shadow that followed you from that small town. I saw Alias Thorne come to our door 30 years ago when you were out on the road. He knew, William. He knew about the restaurant. He knew that the fire wasn't an accident. He knew you did it to get the insurance money to buy your first truck. He threatened to destroy everything, not just the business, but the man our children looked up to. I couldn't let him do that. So I made a deal. I paid him. For 30 years, I have been the bridge between your past and your future. I used the logistics rebates, the secret accounts. I became a thief so you wouldn't have to be a criminal. But Robert and Chloe, they've started talking to him. They don't know who he is, but they know he has power. I'm tired, William. The cancer is taking my strength, and I can no longer hold back the tide. I'm sorry I lied to you. I did it because I loved the man you became more than I hated the boy you were. Please, forgive our children. They are only doing what they saw us do. They are chasing a dream that was built on a lie." I dropped the letter. The paper fluttered to the concrete floor like a dying bird. Everything I had believed about my life was a fabrication. My success wasn't built on hard work alone, it was built on a crime. My marriage wasn't built on honesty, it was built on a 30-year cover-up. And my children weren't just greedy, they were the inevitable result of a legacy steeped in deception. I stood in that cold storage unit, 72 years old, and realized I was a hollow man. I had spent 40 years being Iron Will, the man who solved every problem, only to find out I was the source of the rot. But then, I heard a sound, the slow, rhythmic crunch of gravel behind me. I turned around. Standing in the doorway of the storage unit was a man about my age, dressed in a tailored coat that cost more than a small house. He had a cane with a silver head, and a smile that looked like a scar. "It took you long enough to find the letter, William," the man said. "Elias Thorne. You're dead," I whispered. "Not quite," he said, stepping into the light. "But your reputation is. Did you know the feds just executed a search warrant on your main office? It seems some anonymous's tips led them to the same records your wife kept so neatly in this cabinet. the insurance fraud, the arson. The statutes of limitations might be over, but the RICO charges for the money laundering through the Teresa Fund are very much alive. He leaned on his cane, his eyes gleaming with a malicious joy. I didn't just want your company, William. I wanted to see you stand in a courtroom and admit that the great iron will is just a common crook. And the best part? Your son, Robert? He's the one who gave the feds the key to the digital files. He made a deal, William. He traded you for his own freedom. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years. Not rage, not fear, but a cold, calculated clarity. You think you've won, Elias, I said, taking a step toward him. I know I have, he sneered. You have no allies left. Your daughter is a felon, your son is a rat, and your wife is a ghost. What you don't understand about logistics, Elias, I said, my voice dropping to a gravelly low, is that the most important part of the journey isn't the start, it's the finish, and I haven't reached the end of my line yet. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge I was about to enact wasn't going to be against my children. It was going to be against the man who had been pulling their strings for 50 years. And I was going to use the one thing he didn't think I had left. The truth. What happened next changed the face of the Miller Empire forever. Elias Thorne stood there, a shadow from a past I had tried to burn to ashes, looking at me with the smug satisfaction of a man who had finally trapped a ghost. The storage unit felt smaller, the cold concrete walls closing in like the lid of a casket. I looked at the letter in my hand, Teresa's last confession, and then at the monster who had been feeding on my family's soul for 3 decades. I had spent 50 years running from a fire I started at 17, only to find myself standing in the middle of a conflagration I couldn't control. You look old, William, Elias said, tapping his silver-headed cane against the floor. The sound was rhythmic, mocking. All that power, all those trucks, all that iron will, and here you are, trembling in a storage locker because you found out your wife was a better liar than you were. She wasn't a liar, Elias, I said, my voice finally finding its edge. She was a shield. She protected me from a parasite. Elias laughed, a dry, rattling sound. She bought you time, but time's a luxury you've run out of. Your son, Robert? He's currently at the federal building downtown. He's telling them all about the offshore accounts, the Teresa Fund, and the way you've been laundering insurance rebates for years. He thinks if he gives them his father, he gets to keep his freedom. I almost feel sorry for you, to be traded for a plea deal by your own flesh and blood. I felt the blow, deeper than any sledgehammer could strike. Robert, my son, he hadn't just been weak, he'd been weaponized. He was handing the feds the keys to my life, to save himself from a gambling debt that Elias had likely orchestrated from the start. It was a perfect circle of betrayal. The feds are at your office, William, Elias continued, leaning in close. I could smell the peppermint on his breath, a sharp contrast to the rot in his eyes. By morning, the Miller name will be synonymous with fraud, arson, and organized crime. But I'm a reasonable man. Sign over your remaining shares to Global Logistics. Give me the company, and I'll make sure the feds lose the records regarding the arson. I'll let you retire in that big, empty house of yours. You can spend your final years wondering where it all went wrong. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the 17-year-old boy with ash on his face. I thought about the 36 years of allowances Teresa had paid this man. And then, I thought about the one thing Elias Thorne had forgotten. He thought I was a businessman who got lucky. He forgot I was a driver who knew how to handle a rig in a blind blizzard. You don't survive 50 years in logistics by only having one route. I'm not signing anything, Elias, I said softly. His smile flickered. Then you're going to die in a cage. Maybe, I said, stepping past him toward the door of the unit. But I won't be alone. I walked out into the frigid night, leaving him standing among the boxes of my wife's secrets. I didn't go to the office. I didn't go to the police. I went to a small, nondescript diner on the edge of the city where August was waiting for me in a back booth. He had a laptop open and 3 phones on the table. He was there, I said, sliding into the booth. I know. We tracked his car, August replied. Will, it's bad. The feds are hauling boxes out of headquarters as we speak. Robert is singing like a canary. He's giving them everything James put together. Every suspicious transfer, every creative accounting trick Robert ever used, and he's pinning it all on you. Good, I said. August paused, a fry halfway to his mouth. Good, Will? They're going to arrest you by sunrise. Let them, I said, leaning forward. They're looking for a criminal. I'm going to give them a conspirator. August, did you find what I asked for? August nodded and turned the laptop toward me. Teresa wasn't just paying him, Will. She was a bookkeeper by trade. She knew that in a deal like this, you need insurance. She didn't just record the payments in that ledger. She recorded the conversations. She kept a digital vault of every time Elias Thorne called her to demand more money. She kept the emails where he threatened to expose the arsonist. She kept the records of how Thorne was using her payments to fund Global Logistics, the very company James was trying to sell Miller Logistics. And acted. I felt a surge of hope, cold and sharp. Extortion, money laundering, racketeering. And the best part? August smiled. The Dubai Group? They're a front. Thorne has been using them to wash money from half a dozen different operations. If the feds follow the money from the Teresa Fund, it doesn't lead to you, Will. It leads directly into a massive international money laundering scheme run by Elias Thorne. Your wife didn't just protect you. She set a trap that's been waiting 30 years for him to step into it. I sat back, the weight of the realization washing over me. Teresa hadn't been planning to leave me. She had been building a case. She knew that one day Elias would come for the whole empire, and she wanted to make sure that when he did, he'd find a noose waiting for him. But what about Robert? I asked, my voice cracking. He's testifying against me. Robert is an idiot, August said. He's testifying to things he doesn't understand. He thinks he's burying you, but he's actually providing the feds with the timeline they need to see Thorne's involvement. We just need to give them the final piece of the puzzle. The letter, I said. The letter, the ledger, and the digital vault, August agreed. But there's a catch. To make this work, you have to admit to the arson. You have to walk into that federal building and tell them exactly what you did 50 years ago. The statute of limitations for the fire is long gone, but the confession is the only thing that makes the extortion charges against Thorne stick. You have to destroy your reputation to save your life. I looked out the window at the city I had spent 40 years trying to own. My reputation died the moment my son walked into that building, August. I'm not Iron Will anymore. I'm just William Miller. And it's time William Miller told the truth. I spent the next 4 hours with August and Mr. Vance, the high-powered attorney I'd hired when the sledgehammer first hit my door. We didn't hide. We didn't run. We walked through the front doors of the federal building at SAO. Home AM. The lobby was quiet, the air smelling of floor wax and bureaucracy. I saw Robert before he saw me. He was sitting on a bench in the hallway, looking small and broken, flanked by 2 agents. When he looked up and saw me, his face drained of color. He looked like he wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Dad, he whispered as I walked past him. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked straight into the office of the assistant U.S. attorney, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days. She was surrounded by the boxes they'd taken from my office. Mr. Miller, she said, looking surprised. I didn't expect you to walk in here on your own. I heard you were looking for the truth about Miller Logistics, I said, sitting down across from her. I'm here to give it to you, but we're not going to talk about the last 8 months. We're going to talk about the last 50 years. And we're going to talk about a man named Elias Thorne. For the next 6 hours, I spoke. I told her about the fire. I told her about the fear that had driven me to build an empire on a secret. And then I showed her the Teresa Fund. I showed her the recordings. I showed her the money trail that led from my wife's desperate payments straight into the accounts of Global Logistics and Elias Thorne's offshore holdings. As I talked, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The agents who had been looking at me like a predator began to look at the documents with a growing sense of awe. They weren't looking at a simple case of corporate fraud anymore. They were looking at the takedown of a criminal mastermind who had been operating in the shadows for half a century. And your son? Jenkins asked, leaning back. He's told us a very different story. My son is a gambler who got in over his head, I said, the words hurting more than the confession. He was a pawn. He did what he thought he had to do to survive. I'm not here to protect him anymore. I'm here to tell you that the man you want isn't the one sitting in the hallway. It's the one waiting to sign a contract for a company he's been stealing for 30 years. By noon, the plan was in motion. The feds didn't arrest me. They gave me a wire. Thorne is meeting you at the office at home PM to finalize the emergency sale, right? Jenkins asked. He thinks he's winning, I said. He thinks I'm broken. Let him keep thinking that, she said. I arrived back at Miller Logistics at Moat, Bonne Nuit, Lum PM. The building felt different. The employees were still there, but they were hushed, watching me with a mix of pity and suspicion. I went to my office. I sat in my chair. I waited. At high, Hung PM exactly, the door opened. Elias Thorne walked in, as arrogant as ever, followed by James and a team of lawyers from Global Logistics. James looked like he'd been through the ringer, but he still had that shark-like glint in his eyes. He thought he'd navigated the storm. He thought he was about to get his payout. "The papers are ready, William," James said, sliding a thick folder across my desk. "Sign them, and this all goes away. Robert's deal is in place. You get your house. We get the company." I looked at the folder. "And what about the Teresa Fund, James? Does that go away too?" James stiffened. Elias smiled. "The Teresa Fund is a settled matter, William. It's part of the transition. Think of it as a legacy payment." "A legacy of extortion," I said, looking directly at Elias. Elias leaned on his cane. "Call it what you want. You're done. Your son betrayed you. Your daughter is a felon. You're sitting in an office that doesn't belong to you anymore. Just sign the damn paper." I picked up the pen. I looked at the signature line. And then I looked at the hidden camera August had installed in the bookshelf behind me. "I didn't know it yet," I said, my voice echoing in the room. But this was the last time I'd ever have to be Iron Will. I didn't sign. Instead, I stood up and walked to the window. "Elias," I said, "do you know what the most important part of logistics is? It's not the route. It's the timing." The doors to my office burst open. Not one, but a dozen federal agents flooded the room. Jenkins was in the lead. "Elias Thorne," she said, her voice like iron. "You're under arrest for racketeering, extortion, and money laundering." "James Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy and fraud." James fell to his knees. The lawyers scrambled, but Elias Thorne didn't move. He just stared at me, his face a mask of frozen fury. You told them?" he hissed. "You confessed to the fire? You destroyed everything for this?" "I didn't destroy anything, Elias," I said, walking toward him. "I just finally put the fire out." As they led him away in handcuffs, Elias leaned toward me. "You think you've won? You've lost your children, William. You've lost your name. You're alone." "I have my dignity," I said. "And for the first time in 50 years, I can sleep without checking the locks." I thought that was the end. I thought I'd finally reached the finish line. I'd taken down the monster. I'd saved the company from a criminal takeover, and I'd finally told the truth. But as I walked out of the building that evening, August met me at the door. He looked pale. "Will," he said, "there's one more thing. We found something in Thorne's personal files. Something about the night of the fire." "What?" I asked, my heart sinking. "You didn't start that fire, Will," August said, handing me a faded document. "Thorne did. He set the restaurant on fire to get the insurance, and he made sure you were the one seen leaving the building. He's been blackmailing you for 50 years for a crime he committed." The world stopped. 50 years. 50 years of guilt. 50 years of paying for a sin that wasn't mine. I felt a laughter bubbling up in my chest, a dark, bitter laughter that sounded like breaking glass. But the real shock was yet to come, because when I got home, I found someone waiting for me on my porch. Someone who shouldn't have been there. It was Chloe. And she wasn't alone. She was holding a manila envelope, and she looked terrified. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "there's one more secret Mom kept. And it's not about the money, it's about Robert." I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was about to rewrite my entire history one last time. The porch light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across Chloe's face. She looked like a ghost of herself, shivering in a thin cardigan that offered no protection against the biting Chicago wind. In her hands, she clutched that manila envelope as if it were a shield, or perhaps a bomb she was afraid to drop. I stood in the doorway. The heavy weight of the day's revelations, the federal raids, Elias Thorne's arrest, the truth about the fire pressing down on my shoulders like a physical burden. I thought I had reached the end of the secrets. I thought the truth had finally set me free. "Dad, I can't keep this," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the dead leaves on the driveway. "I found it in Mom's safe deposit box, the one she told me never to open unless she died, and you were at risk. I thought it was just more money. I thought it was another account. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. The house felt cavernous, the silence echoing in the corners where family laughter used to live. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated birthdays and planned futures that were now ash. She slid the envelope across the wood. It felt cold to the touch. "What is this, Chloe?" I asked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "It's a DNA test, Dad. And a letter. A real one. Not the one she left in the sewing room. This one was meant for the end of the world." I pulled the documents out. My hands, which had steered heavy rigs through mountain passes and signed million-dollar contracts without a tremor, were shaking. I read the technical jargon first, the percentages, the markers, the cold, scientific proof. Then I read the letter. Teresa's handwriting was different here. It wasn't the elegant script of a proud wife. It was the frantic, jagged scrawl of a woman living in a nightmare. She wrote about that final month in our hometown, before the fire. She wrote about Elias Thorne, not as a blackmailer, but as a predator. He hadn't just framed me for the fire to get insurance money. He had taken something from her too. He had used his power and his family's influence to trap her one night when I was working a double shift at the restaurant. She never told me. She was afraid I'd kill him and end up in prison, or that he'd kill me. Then, a month later, we fled. She was already pregnant. She spent 40 years wondering if I'd ever look at Robert and see the man who had hurt her. She spent 40 years paying Elias protection money, not just to hide the fire, but to keep him from ever claiming the boy as his own. Robert wasn't my son. He was the son of the man who had tried to destroy me since I was 17. I felt the air leave my lungs. Every memory I had of Robert holding him in the delivery room, watching him take his first steps. The pride I felt when he graduated, it all curdled. It was like a poison had been injected into my very history. I looked at the kitchen wall, at the height marks we'd carved into the door frame over the years. I had raised the heir of my enemy. I had poured my sweat, my love, and my iron will into the blood of a man who hated me. "He knows, doesn't he?" I asked, looking up at Chloe. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "James found out. He did his own digging when he realized the Teresa Fund was linked to Thorne. He told Robert 3 months ago. That's why Robert changed, Dad. That's why he turned so fast. He didn't just want the money. He felt like his whole life with you was a lie. He thought you knew. He thought you were keeping him in a low position at the company because you hated his real father." The betrayal finally made sense. The cruelty, the sledgehammer, the attempt to lock me away, it wasn't just greed. It was a misplaced, warped sense of vengeance. Robert thought he was the victim of my deception. He thought I had stolen him from his rightful legacy. He didn't realize I was the only thing that had protected him from the monster that sired him. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Chloe sobbed, reaching for my hand. I didn't pull away this time, but I didn't feel the warmth of her touch. I felt hollowed out, a shell of a man standing in the ruins of a life built on a lie. I had hit rock bottom, not when the feds raided my office, and not when the sledgehammer hit my door. I hit rock bottom in that quiet kitchen, realizing that the family I had fought to protect was a ghost. I sat there for an hour, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Chloe eventually fell asleep at the table, her head resting on her arms. I stood up and walked to the boarded-up front door. I looked at the plywood and felt a sudden, strange sense of calm. The iron will hadn't broken. It had just been forged into something sharper, colder. I knew what I had to do. The revenge I had planned for Elias Thorne and James was just the beginning. I needed to finish the work. I needed to purge the rot once and for all. Not just for the company, but for my own soul. I picked up my phone and dialed August. "Will, it's Bone. Hung AM. What's wrong?" "I need a meeting," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Not with the lawyers. Not with the feds. I need you to get Robert out of that federal building. I don't care how many favors you have to pull. Tell them I have more evidence, but I'll only deliver it if I can talk to him privately for 1 hour." "Will, that's dangerous. He's a state witness now." "He's my son," I said, and the word felt like a lie and a truth at the same time, and he needs to hear the end of the story. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a windowless room in a safe house August used for high-profile witnesses. The air was stale, smelling of old coffee and industrial cleaner. The door opened, and Robert was led in. He was in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed to a belly chain. He looked older, his face gaunt, the bravado of the director of operations long gone. He sat down across from me, the chain clinking against the metal table. He wouldn't look at me. So, the old man comes to gloat. He sneered, though his voice lacked conviction. Did you enjoy the show, William? Watching the feds take down the big bad Elias Thorne? I didn't come to gloat, Robert, I said. I slid the DNA test across the table. He glanced at it, and for a second, I saw the mask slip. His eyes widened, then hardened. I already know, James told me. I know I'm not yours. I know you kept me around as a pet, a way to stick it to Thorne by raising his kid as a logistics helper. You think I knew? I leaned forward, my face inches from his. You think for 40 years I looked at you and saw Elias? I loved you, Robert. I loved you more than the trucks, more than the buildings, more than my own life. I didn't know the truth until 3 hours ago. Your mother died keeping this secret to protect you, not me. Robert froze. What? She didn't want you to know you were born from a crime. She didn't want you to know that the man who sired you was the same man who tried to burn your father alive. She paid him every month for 30 years so he would stay away from you. She sacrificed her own peace of mind to give you a father who actually gave a damn. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched as the realization hit him. The rightful legacy he thought he was claiming from Thorne wasn't a kingdom, it was a sewer. He hadn't been joining forces with his real father. He'd been siding with his mother's rapist to destroy the only man who had ever truly loved him. Robert's breath hitched. A single tear tracked through the stubble on his cheek. He said you stole the company from him. He said you were a thief who used Mom to get ahead. Elias Thorne is a monster who feeds on lies, I said, and you gave him exactly what he wanted. You gave him the chance to destroy the Miller name using the hand of the boy I raised. Robert let out a broken, strangled sound. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the cold metal of the table. The clinking of his chains was the only sound in the room. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix the door, Robert, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. And it doesn't fix the company. But it does give us a choice. I stood up. I hadn't come here for an apology. I had come for a weapon. The feds have enough to put Thorne away for a long time on the money laundering. But he's got high-priced lawyers. He might beat the RICO. He might even beat the extortion if they can't prove the Teresa Fund wasn't a voluntary gift. Robert looked up, his eyes red and desperate. What do you want me to do? I want you to tell them about the meetings, I said. Not the ones James organized, the private ones, the ones where Elias told you how to hide the money, the ones where he told you he was going to liquidate the company and leave no witnesses. I know you recorded them, Robert. You're a gambler, you always keep a hole card. Robert hesitated, then nodded slowly. I have them. On a cloud drive. James didn't know. Then you're going to give them to me, I said. And in exchange, I'm going to make sure you don't spend the next 20 years in a cell. I've already spoken to the AUSA. If you provide the smoking gun that links Thorne to the direct intent to dismantle a multi-state infrastructure, they'll drop the embezzlement charges to a misdemeanor. You'll be free. But you'll be penniless. I don't care about the money, Robert whispered. I can't be his son anymore. You never were, I said. I walked out of the room, leaving him there. My revenge plan was now in its final phase. I had the recordings, I had the confession, and I had the truth. But there was one more thing I had to do. I had to ensure that the Miller empire didn't just survive, it had to be reborn. I returned to the office that morning. The feds were gone, leaving behind empty desks and a lingering sense of dread. I called a meeting of the remaining board members and the senior staff. They gathered in the boardroom, looking at me like I was a condemned man. I have a statement, I said, standing at the head of the table. Miller Logistics as you know it is dead. A murmur of panic went through the room. By the end of the week, I will be stepping down as chairman. The company is being restructured into an employee-owned trust. Every man and woman who stayed during this crisis will own a piece of what we build next. I am taking my personal assets, every cent I have left, and creating a foundation in my wife's name. A foundation for victims of corporate extortion and domestic violence. I looked at their stunned faces. The Miller name won't be on the trucks anymore. It doesn't need to be. We're calling the new entity Foundry Logistics, because we were forged in the fire, and we're still standing. As the meeting broke up, August walked over to me. You're giving it all away, Will? After 50 years of fighting? I'm not giving it away, August. I'm letting it go. You can't hold on to a legacy built on a secret. You have to burn the old growth so the new can live. I felt lighter than I had in decades. The iron will wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go. But as I walked toward my car, a black sedan pulled up. The window rolled down, and a man I recognized as Elias Thorne's lead counsel looked out at me. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice smooth and threatening. "My client wanted me to remind you that even if he goes away, he has friends. Deep friends. You might have won the battle, but you've made yourself a very prominent target." I leaned down, looking the man in the eye. "Tell Elias that I've spent 50 years being afraid of the dark. Now, I'm the one holding the match." I watched them drive away, but I didn't feel the old fear. I felt a cold, sharp anticipation. The final twist wasn't just about the past. It was about the final move on the board. And I didn't know it yet, but the last person I expected to see was about to show up at my door with a final piece of the puzzle that would change the meaning of everything. The black sedan disappeared into the gray Chicago fog, leaving the smell of expensive exhaust and a lingering threat in the air. I stood on the sidewalk outside the building that used to bear my name, feeling the wind whip through my coat. Elias Thorne's lawyer thought he was leaving me with a warning. He thought he was reminding me of my vulnerability. But as I watched the taillights fade, I realized something he didn't. You can't threaten a man who has already walked through his own funeral. I had lost my son, my daughter, my company, and the memory of the woman I loved. I was a man with no shadows left to hide in. I drove home slowly, the city lights blurred by a light rain. When I pulled into my driveway, the plywood on my front door felt like a badge of honor. It was ugly, it was raw, but it was still standing. I walked up the porch steps, my knees aching, ready to sink into the silence of an empty house. But the silence was already occupied. Sitting on the top step, huddled in a heavy hooded sweatshirt, was Sam, my grandson, the only person in this entire twisted saga who hadn't asked me for a cent or a favor. "Sam, what are you doing here, son? It's nearly midnight." He stood up, his face pale in the yellow glow of the porch light. He wasn't crying, but his eyes had a haunted depth that reminded me of Teresa in her final days. He was holding a small, weathered wooden box, the kind Teresa used to keep her most precious sewing needles in. "Grandma gave me this 3 years ago," Sam said, his voice cracking. "She told me to keep it under my bed. She said I wasn't allowed to open it until I turned 18, or until the house stopped feeling like a home. I turned 18 last week, Grandpa, but I was too scared to look. After everything that happened with Dad and Aunt Chloe, I finally opened it tonight." I felt a cold prickle of anticipation at the base of my neck. I didn't know it yet, but the final piece of the puzzle wasn't held by lawyers or federal agents. It was held by a teenager who just wanted to know who his family really was. I unlocked the door and ushered him inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the DNA test and the letters from earlier that evening still scattered across the wood like the debris of a shipwreck. Sam set the wooden box down. Inside was a single cassette tape and a key to a safe deposit box at a bank I hadn't used in 20 years. "There's a note, too," Sam whispered, sliding a small scrap of paper toward me. "For William. The truth is the only thing that won't burn." I went into the study and found an old tape player I'd kept in a drawer. The mechanical click of the play button echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. At first, there was only static. Then, a voice filled the air. It wasn't the tired, sick voice of the woman I'd lost. It was the vibrant, sharp voice of the Teresa I'd married, the woman who could out-negotiate a union rep and still have dinner on the table by 6. "William," the recording began, "if you're hearing this, it means the fire has come back for you. I always knew it would. Elias Thorne is a man who doesn't know how to let a debt die. But there's something you need to know about that night in Mukngin Chin Chambay Mubon. Something I've carried every single day so you wouldn't have to." I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You think you started that fire, William. You spent 50 years believing your hand held the match because you wanted to save me, to get us out of that town. But you didn't. I saw you leave the kitchen that night. I saw you head toward the alley. But before you could even reach the kerosene, the building was already breathing smoke. Elias Thorne set that fire. William. He set it to kill his father for the insurance, and he set it to frame you so he'd always have a leash on your neck. I saw him do it, and I saw something else." The tape hissed for a second, a long, Agonizing pause. I didn't just watch, William. I went into the office while the walls were turning black. I didn't go for the insurance papers. I went for the safe. Elias's father had a cache of cash money he'd been skimming from the town's payroll for years. I took it. All of it. $300,000. That's how we bought the first truck, William. Not with insurance money. Not with your sweat. We bought our life with the money I stole from the man who tried to destroy us. I sat in the dark, the tape spinning in silence long after the recording ended. The iron will, the self-made man. Every brick of the empire I'd built was laid on a foundation of Teresa's ruthlessness. She hadn't just protected me. She had outplayed the world to give me the life she thought I deserved. She had let me believe I was a criminal, so I would be hungry enough to become a king. And she had let Elias Thorne think he was blackmailing her, when in reality, she was using his own father's stolen wealth to build the very walls he was now trying to tear down. "Grandpa?" Sam's voice broke the trance. "Are you okay?" I looked at him, and for the first time in months, the fog in my head cleared. I realized that the Iron Will wasn't just my name. It was a mantle Teresa had forged for me, a suit of armor she'd made me wear to keep the world from seeing how vulnerable we really were. "I'm more than okay, Sam," I said, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. "I'm finally awake." The final move didn't take place in a courtroom. It took place 2 days later in the visiting room of the county jail where Elias Thorne was being held pending his transfer to federal custody. He looked smaller in the jumpsuit, the arrogance replaced by a twitchy, nervous energy. He still had his lawyers, but I had the truth. I sat across from him, separated by a thick pane of glass. I didn't pick up the phone. I just held a single piece of paper against the glass. It was a ledger from the safe deposit box Sam had found. Elias squinted at the paper, then his eyes went wide. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. "You recognize the numbers, Elias?" I said, my voice carrying through the speaker. "This isn't a record of the money Teresa paid you. This is a record of where that money went. For 30 years, every protection payment she sent you was funneled through a series of accounts she controlled. She wasn't paying you, Elias. She was using you as a pass-through. She was laundering your illegal gambling profits through Miller Logistics, turning your dirty cash into clean equity in my company. You didn't own me. You were my biggest investor, and you didn't even know it." Elias gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "You're lying. That bitch. She wouldn't have known how." "She knew everything," I said, my voice cold and hard as a diamond. "She knew you were the one who set the fire. She saw you. And she spent the rest of her life making sure that every penny you ever touched ended up building the Miller legacy. By the time the feds finish auditing your Dubai holdings, they're going to find that the money doesn't exist anymore. It's all been absorbed into the employee-owned trust I just created. You didn't just lose the company, Elias. You bought it for the people you tried to screw over. You're the reason my drivers are going to retire as millionaires." Elias lunged at the glass, screaming obscenities, but the guards moved in instantly, dragging him back toward the shadows. I stood up and walked away, never looking back. The fire that had started in what ngin chin chambay muy bon was finally out. The aftermath was a slow, quiet settling of the dust. James was disbarred and sentenced to 8 years for his role in the conspiracy. Chloe moved to the lake house permanently, living on a modest stipend from the foundation I'd set up. She hasn't called me, and I haven't called her. Some bridges are burned so thoroughly that there isn't enough lumber in the world to rebuild them. Robert is a different story. He's working in a warehouse in a different state, under a different name. I send him a letter once a month. He hasn't replied yet, but I know he reads them. Maybe in 10 years, or 20, we can sit on a porch and talk about the woman who tricked us both into being better men than we were born to be. As for me, I sold the big house. It was too full of ghosts and boarded up doors. I moved into a small apartment downtown, overlooking the rail yards where the Miller trucks now Foundry Logistics roll out every morning. I spend my days at the foundation, helping families who have been crushed by the same kind of greed that almost took me under. I sat on my small balcony this evening, a glass of scotch in my hand, watching the sunset bleed over the skyline. Sam was inside, studying for his business ethics exam. He's going to be the first Miller to run a company with clean hands from day one. I thought about the iron will one last time. People think strength is about how much you can take, how many blows you can withstand before you break. But they're wrong. True strength is about what you do with the pieces after the breaking is done. It's about having the courage to tell the truth, even when the truth burns down the world you built. I didn't know it when I was 17, and I didn't know it when I was 50. But at 72, I finally understand. Success isn't about the fleet of trucks or the million-dollar contracts. It's about being able to look in the mirror and know that your soul doesn't belong to anyone else. Not to your enemies, not to your secrets, and not even to your children. My name is William Miller. I am an arsonist who never held a match. I am a father to a son who isn't mine. I am the owner of an empire built on a clever woman's revenge. But more than anything, I am a man who is, finally, for the first time in my life, free. The road ahead is long, and the nights are still cold. But as I watch the trucks roll out into the darkness, their headlights cutting through the fog, I know one thing for certain. The legacy isn't the name on the door, it's the truth in the heart. And my heart? It's finally made of iron,